Here's the gray chassis before, and here's the chassis after it's been dyed black. How's it going, everybody? Greg here with RC Driver, and I have a really quick and easy how-to to show you today. It's how to dye your vehicle's parts. Now, a lot of cars have different colored parts on them, maybe gray plastic, blue plastics, green plastics. And maybe you get tired of that look and you want to change it up, give it a more stealthy look or something. And that's when you go and you dye your vehicle's parts. Now, a lot of people just go right to black. That's the easiest way to dye your parts, and it gives it a really cool look. And that's exactly what I'm going to do today with this Traxxas Stampede 4x4 chassis. It looks okay in gray. I've got a lot of gray Traxxas vehicle chassis around, but I want to make this one look different. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to just dye the parts. Now, if you can boil pasta, you really shouldn't have a problem with this. But all you're really going to need is you're going to need to go to the store and grab a bottle of RIT fabric dye. This works really well. This is the liquid form. They also have a powdered form. I've used the powdered before and it works okay. Sometimes I thought it turned a little purpley, but the black liquid seems to work really, really well. The other thing, of course, that you're going to need is a large pot. A pot that basically will fit the chassis that you're going to boil. Of course, you can put it in on an angle and flip it around once one area is dyed. But it's really good to just find a very, very large pot and put the whole chassis in if possible. And of course, you're going to need a stove, some water, and that's really about it. But I should really mention that you should clean this chassis if it is used before you try to dye it. If there's a lot of greases and oils on here, that could affect the dye taking to the plastic. The other thing to note is that you have to make sure that your chassis or whatever parts you're going to dye would be able to accept a dye. It needs to be a porous plastic. So how do you figure out if the plastic is porous? Well, if the chassis part, whatever, has a flat look to it, then most likely it is porous. If it has a very, very high polished shine, that most likely will not dye. It's very difficult to dye a very high sheen plastic part. So of course there are a few exceptions out there. There are some wheels out there that have a very nice shine to them. And they will actually take dye, some wings as well, but there are plastics out there that won't accept the dye. And I just want you to be aware of that, so when, if you do try to dip a plastic or dye a plastic that has that high shine to it, and you pull it out and only the edges are perhaps dyed, and it kind of ruins the part. Just want to make you aware that there is that potential out there. All right, let me go show you how easy it is to dye a chassis black. Okay, so here we are in my kitchen, and I found one of my wife's larger pots. I hope she doesn't watch this because that's going to get me in a lot of trouble later. But basically, just got to fill the pot up with water about 3/4 of the way and then put it on the stove to boil. Okay, so I have my pot of water on the stove. It's boiling now. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to back down on the heat just a little bit to like a medium-high heat, then pour in the RIT fabric dye. Now, since I have so much water in this pot, I'm probably going to use about half of the bottle of RIT fabric dye in there just to make sure I've got a lot of pigment in there to get into that plastic. Once I dump the dye in there, give it a quick stir with a spoon. Make sure you use a metal spoon so you don't dye your plastic spoon. And then I'm just going to drop the plastic chassis in there. Excuse me, I'm actually going to slip the chassis in there. You don't want to splash it because the dye can get everywhere. You don't want to dye anything else around your kitchen. Trust me, your family members would not like that. And then I'm just going to leave the chassis in there for about 10 minutes. It's going to be on an angle because the pot isn't big enough to fit the whole chassis. So after about 10 minutes, I'm going to pull it out, flip it around, slip it back in, give it another 10 minutes to boil, and then pull the chassis out and see how I did. All right, so my 10-minute timer just went off, and I'm going to give the chassis a look, see how it's doing. As you can see, it looks pretty good. I think it's time to flip it around and just dye that nose piece. I didn't want to overfill the pot because it is boiling. Didn't want the dye to get all over the stove, but I'll just flip it around, maybe give it another 5 minutes since a lot of the top is dyed, and see how it looks then. Okay, so the chassis has been boiling for about 15 minutes now in total, and I've just shut the stove off. I'm going to pull the chassis out, bring it over to the sink, wash it off, and make sure it's the color I want. If you don't dye your chassis long enough when using black, it could have this purpley color. If it still has that purpley color, you're going to want to put it back into the pot, turn it back up so it's at a boil again, and keep on boiling it for a few more minutes until that purple color goes away. And there you have it. In about 20 minutes total, I changed the look of the chassis and it looks pretty cool. Now you get RIP fabric dye in pretty much any grocery store or craft store or fabric store. So it's readily available, just got to hunt it down. But there's other colors as well. If you have some white plastics, maybe you want to dye it blue or red or something like that. So you could really get creative with different dyes, but I tend to like the stealthy black look, so I have a couple of bottles of RIP fabric dye on hand. Now, one thing I should mention is you really can't go backward on the color, meaning, you know, if you have a black chassis, you really can't turn it into a yellow chassis. You really have to go towards a darker color. So that's why I took this gray chassis here and dyed it black. You also have to think about what the dye would do. I mean, if you went and tried to dye this gray chassis red, it may have a dullish red to it. You may be able to get some red into it, but it might have a weird color. So you really have to think about what the dye is going to do to the existing part. Hope you guys enjoyed this little how-to. If you haven't done so yet, please click the subscribe button. We have a lot of how-to information on the RC Driver channel coming up. If you can take one more second, give this video a like, I'd really appreciate it. And if you haven't done so yet, head over to rcdriver.com. We've got a lot of cool RC information over there.